Hi everyone, this is Chapter 7 of Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of $2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entailed, in default of heirs male, on a distant relation, and their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton and had left her £4,000. So we get some financial information in this paragraph. Mrs. Bennet has some money that she gets every year from her father, who's passed away. But Mr. Bennet, he owns his house right now, but the estate is entailed. If something is entailed, that means that it is bound to go to the oldest male heir. So if you watched my Who Wants a Post-it video, you've kind of seen how British property works, that you want to keep everything intact so that instead of inheriting a little piece of something, you inherit a larger piece of property. Because the Bennet's estate is entailed, that means that not Mr. Bennet, but probably someone before him, so maybe his father, possibly his grandfather, said the estate will always be inherited by the oldest male heir. Because the Bennets have 5 daughters, none of them are men, and none of them can inherit their house. So at some point in the future, it's going to go to a distant relative. We find out who that is later on in the novel. But it's not going to be inherited by any of them. So Mrs. Bennet's concerns about them marrying a rich husband are in part because this house is entailed and none of their daughters will really have a place to live unless they marry someone or unless a relative takes them in at some point in their lives. So she's concerned, and she's concerned with just reason. Their daughters will not inherit this house in the future. That decision was probably made by someone thinking that, we'll have a male heir and that child will always inherit the house and keep it together and intact. But it's pretty concerning for our main characters. This is talking about Mrs. Bennet. So she, Mrs. Bennet, had a sister married to a Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to their father and succeeded him in the business, and a brother settled in London in a respectable line of trade. So Mrs. Bennet has 2 siblings. So she has a sister who's married to a man named Mr. Phillips. Her sister is going to be Mrs. Phillips, and then a brother. The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from Meryton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies, who are usually tempted thither 3 or 4 times a week to pay their duty to their aunt and to a milliner's shop just over the way. A milliner's shop is where ladies' hats and bonnets are sold. The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, and remember Catherine is Kitty, so you see those names used interchangeably. Catherine and Lydia were particularly frequent in these attentions. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters, and when nothing better offered, a walk to Meryton was necessary to amuse their morning hours and furnish conversation for the evening. And, however bare of news the country in general might be, they always contrived to learn some from their aunt. At present, indeed, they were well supplied both with news and happiness by the recent arrival of a militia regiment in the neighborhood. It was to remain the whole winter, and Meryton was the headquarters. So the militia volunteer troops in England, there was concern that Napoleon would try and invade England, so the militia is kind of moving all around the countryside in different, hopefully, strategic spots. Their visits to Mrs. Phillips were now productive of the most interesting intelligence. Every day added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections. Their lodgings were not long a secret, and at length they began to know the officers themselves. Mr. Phillips visited them all, and this opened up to his nieces a source of felicity unknown before. They could talk of nothing but officers, and Mr. Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave animation to their mother, was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign. So the younger Bennet daughters are a little bit obsessed with all the militia guys who are in town, and they are enjoying their aunt's gossip about all these men, and hopefully visiting them. After listening one morning to their effusions on this subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be 2 of the silliest girls in the country. I have suspected it some time, but I am now convinced." Catherine was disconcerted and made no answer, but Lydia, with perfect indifference, continued to express her admiration of Captain Carter and her hope of seeing him in the course of the day, as he was going the next morning to London. "I'm astonished, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. If I wish to think slightingly of anybody's children, it should not be of my own, however. If my children are silly, I must hope to be always sensible of it. Yes, but as it happens, they are all of them very clever. This is the only point, I flatter myself, on which we do not agree. I had hoped that our sentiments coincided in every particular, but I must so far differ from you as to think our two youngest daughters uncommonly foolish." So that's Mr. and Mrs. Bennet having an argument there. Mr. Bennet is being, again, kind of sarcastic, but he's saying, I think that Catherine and Lydia are being ridiculous or just being silly. Mrs. Bennet says, "How could you say that about our daughters?" And Mr. Bennet kind of says, these are the facts, this is what it is. "My dear Mr. Bennet, you must not expect such girls to have the sense of their father and mother. When they get to our age, I dare say they will not think about officers any more than we do. I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself very well, and indeed, so I do still at my heart, and if a smart young colonel with 5,000 or 6,000 a year should want one of my girls, I shall not say nay to him. And I thought Colonel Forster looked very becoming the other night at Sir William's in his regimentals." We have a little bit of some sarcasm going on from our author, Jane Austen. So Mrs. Bennet says, "Oh, at this point in time, I'm not thinking about the officers," and then she very clearly remembers an officer she used to like and is still kind of checking out the militiamen who are in town now. "Mamma," cried Lydia, "my aunt says that Colonel Forster and Captain Carter do not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came. She sees them now very often standing in Clark's library." Mrs. Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of the footman with a note for Miss Bennet, Jane Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled with pleasure, and she was eagerly calling out while her daughter read. "Well, Jane, who is it from? What is this about? What does he say? Well, Jane, make haste and tell us. Make haste, my love." "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. "My dear friend, you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me. If you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives, for a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on the receipt of this. My brother and the gentlemen are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." So Caroline invites Jane over to spend the day with her and her sisters. "With the officers!" cried Lydia. "I wonder my aunt did not tell us of that." "Dining out," said Mrs. Bennet. "That is very unlucky." "Can I have the carriage?" said Jane. "No, my dear, you had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night." "That would be a good scheme," said Elizabeth, "if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home." "Oh, but the gentlemen will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs. I'd much rather go in the coach." "But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I am sure. They are wanted in the farm, Mr. Bennet, are they not?" "They are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can get them." "But if you have got them today," said Elizabeth, "my mother's purpose will be answered." She did at last extort from her husband an acknowledgment that the horses were engaged. Jane was therefore obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. So Mrs. Bennet is pretty scheming here. They have a carriage, so they have a covered carriage drawn by horses that would take Jane to Netherfield. But Mrs. Bennet wants her to go on horseback because she thinks, if it rains and she doesn't have any sort of covering over her, she'll have to stay overnight at the Bingleys and she'll be able to see Mr. Bingley and spend more time with Mr. Bingley, and then maybe that will forward a marriage. It doesn't quite exactly go according to plan, though, because fairly soon after Jane leaves, it starts raining and she actually gets rained on. So maybe in the ideal Mrs. Bennet scenario, Jane would arrive at Netherfield, then it would start raining, and then she'd get stuck there. But she gets rained on her way to Netherfield. "This was a lucky idea of mine, indeed," said Mrs. Bennet more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of all the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. "My dearest Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning home till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me. And excepting a sore throat and headache, there is not much in the matter with me. Yours and company. So Jane writes to Elizabeth and says, I'm really not feeling well. They've actually sent for either a physician or someone to go make sure she's okay, and she is stuck at the Bingleys. So Mrs. Bennet should be happy about this, because this has gone according to plan, but Jane's health is not in the best condition. Well, my dear, said Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth had read the note aloud, if your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it will be a comfort to you to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley, and under your orders. Oh, I am not at all afraid of her dying. People do not die of little trifling colds. She will be taken good care of. As long as she stays there, it is all very well. I would go and see her if I could have the carriage. Elizabeth, feeling really anxious, was determined to go to her, though the carriage was not to be had. And as she was no horsewoman, walking was her only alternative. She declared her resolution. How can you be so silly, cried her mother, as to think of such a thing in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you get there. I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want. Is this a hint to me, Lizzie, said her father, to send for the horses? No, indeed, I do not wish to avoid the walk. The distance is nothing when one has a motive, only 3 miles. I shall be back by dinner. I admire the activity of your benevolence, observed Mary, but every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason, and in my opinion, exertion should always be in proportion to what is required. We will go as far as Meryton with you, said Catherine and Lydia. Elizabeth accepted their company, and the 3 young ladies set off together. If we make haste, said Lydia, as they walked along, perhaps we may see something of Captain Carter before he goes. So Elizabeth decides that although the ground is still wet and she's probably going to get very dirty on her walk, that she's going to go over to see Jane. Mrs. Bennet is concerned about appearances and says that won't do, and Elizabeth says, I'm just going to see Jane, it'll be fine. Because Lydia and Kitty want to go see the officers in Meryton, they agree to walk with Elizabeth that far, and then the rest of the walk Lizzie will do on her own. In Meryton they parted. The 2 youngest repaired to the lodgings of one of the officers' wives, and Elizabeth continued her walk alone, crossing field after field at a quick pace, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles with impatient activity, and finding herself at last within view of the house, with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. She was shown into the breakfast parlor, where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a great deal of surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles so early in the day, in such dirty weather, and by herself, was almost incredible to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. She was received, however, very politely by them, and in their brother's manners there was something better than politeness. There was good humor and kindness. So just remember, Mrs. Hurst is Mr. Bingley's married sister, and Miss Bingley is his unmarried sister. They're judging Elizabeth because she does show up to Netherfield pretty dirty from her walk. Mr. Bingley doesn't care. He's genuinely happy to see her. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst nothing at all. The former was divided between admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given to her complexion, and doubt as to the occasions justifying her coming so far alone. The latter was thinking only of his breakfast. So Mr. Darcy and Mr. Hurst are also at Netherfield. Mr. Darcy thinks Elizabeth looks very pretty, although he probably won't say anything about it, and he's kind of wondering, should she really have walked all that way alone? Was that silly, or did it actually have a reason? Mr. Hurst is just concerned about food. Her inquiries after her sister were not very favorably answered. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up, was very feverish, and not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth was glad to be taken to her immediately, and Jane, who had only been withheld by the fear of giving alarm or inconvenience from expressing in her note how much she longed for such a visit, was delighted at her entrance. She was not equal, however, to much conversation, and when Miss Bingley left them together, could attempt little beside expressions of gratitude for the extraordinary kindness she was treated with. Elizabeth silently attended her. When breakfast was over, they were joined by the sisters, and Elizabeth began to like them herself when she saw how much affection and solicitude they showed for Jane. The apothecary came, and having examined his patient, said, as might be supposed, that she had caught a violent cold, and that they must endeavour to get the better of it. advised her to return to bed, and promised her some draughts or some medicine. An apothecary is similar to our modern day pharmacist, so not necessarily someone who would treat medical issues, but they would be able to prescribe and make different medications. The advice was followed readily, for the feverish symptoms increased, and her head ached acutely. Elizabeth did not quit her room for a moment, nor were the other ladies often absent. The gentlemen being out, they had in fact nothing to do elsewhere. A cold in the 1700s, Regency era, early 1800s, was a little bit more serious than a cold is today, because you didn't have the same sanitation measures, you didn't have the same medical treatment. So although it's not seriously concerning that Jane has a cold, it is enough to worry people. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go, and very unwillingly said so. Miss Bingley offered her the carriage, and she only wanted a little pressing to accept it, when Jane testified such concern in parting with her that Miss Bingley was obliged to convert the offer of the chaise into an invitation to remain at Netherfield for the present. Elizabeth most thankfully consented, and a servant was dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the family with her stay and bring back a supply of clothes. So Elizabeth is also going to remain at Netherfield at least until Jane recovers and can travel home. And that's chapter 7.